Hello, and welcome back, dear listener. Picture, if you will, an English garden in the soft hush of a summer evening. Roses heavy with scent, lanterns just beginning to glow, and laughter drifting across a lawn, untouched, it seems, by any shadow of misfortune. But among the guests that evening sits a woman no one truly knows, elegant, watchful, and carrying with her a fan of emerald green, said to be as beautiful as it is mysterious. By nightfall, she will be dead, and that very fan, still resting in her lifeless hand, will hold the first thread of a secret someone was willing to kill to protect. This is The Mystery of the Emerald Fan, a tale of old grudges, hidden pasts, and one Belgian detective with little patience for anything less than the truth. Hercule Poirot has arrived at the party. And he is, as always, paying very close attention. So settle in, pour yourself something pleasant, and let us begin. A fan among roses. The gardens of Ashworth Manor had never looked lovelier than on that particular evening in June, and Hercule Poirot, standing rather stiffly near a trellis of white roses with a glass of lemonade he did not especially want, found himself thinking that English summers, whatever their faults, did know how to stage a garden party. He had come at the invitation of Lady Cynthia Ashworth, a woman of considerable energy and even more considerable conviction that a famous detective added a certain something to any gathering, rather in the way a string quartet did, or an ice sculpture. Poirot had accepted the invitation, chiefly because Lady Ashworth's cook was reputed to be excellent, and he had not been disappointed. He had also, if he were honest with himself, accepted because he was a little bored, and a garden party, even a dull one, was preferable to an empty afternoon. This, however, did not look as though it would be a dull party. "You are admiring the roses, Monsieur Poirot," said a voice at his elbow, and he turned to find Lady Ashworth herself, resplendent in lavender silk, fanning herself with quick, irritated little movements, as though the heat were a personal affront. "I am admiring everything, madame," Poirot said, with a small bow. "The roses, the lawn, the really very excellent lemonade. It is a fine party." "It would be finer," Lady Ashworth said, lowering her voice, "if certain people did not insist on behaving as though they were the only two people in the garden." She nodded, with the subtlety of a woman pointing with a flag toward a bench beneath a flowering chestnut tree, where a striking woman in dark green sat in close conversation with a young man who appeared to be hanging on her every word with the devotion of a spaniel. "Madame Voss," Poirot said, for he had been told the name upon arrival, along with a great deal of speculation he had not asked for. "She is your neighbor, I believe. She is a mystery, Monsieur Poirot, which in my experience generally means the same thing as a nuisance." Lady Ashworth's fan snapped shut. 2 years she has been at the old rectory, and what do we know of her? That she is a widow, that she came from somewhere on the continent during the war, and that she has the most extraordinary collection of jewelry for a woman who claims to have lost everything in it. Make of that what you will. Poirot, who made rather a great deal of it, said only, "People who have lost everything sometimes hold tightly to what little remains, madame. It is human nature, non? It is suspicious, is what it is," said Lady Ashworth, and bustled off to harass a footman about the ice. Poirot remained by the roses a moment longer, observing, Madame Irina Voss was, he thought, a woman built for observation. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, but possessed of the kind of face that made one look twice, then a third time, searching for what exactly it was that held the eye. Dark hair silvering elegantly at the temples, a long neck, eyes the color of strong tea, and very watchful, even as she smiled at the young man beside her. And in her hand, Poirot noted this with the particular attention he gave to small, beautiful, unnecessary objects. A fan. It was not, he thought, an English fan. The frame had the look of old ivory, yellowed gently with age, and the leaf was painted silk, in a deep, rich green, embroidered at the edges. with something that caught the light. Small emeralds, surely real, set with the kind of careless confidence that only old money or old theft could produce. It was a magnificent object. It was also, Poirot thought, a curious thing for a woman in reduced circumstances to be waving about so casually at a garden party. "You are staring at Madame Voss's fan, Monsieur Poirot," said a dry voice, and he turned to find a thin, sharp-faced man of perhaps 40, dressed with the kind of careful shabbiness that suggested either an aesthetic choice or an empty bank account. "Everyone does, eventually. Captain Edmund Hartley," he added, extending a hand. "I farm, or attempt to, the land just east of here. Hercule Poirot. You know the lady well. Captain Hartley. Well enough to have made a fool of myself over her last spring, if that's what you're asking." Hartley's smile was thin and not entirely pleasant. "She turned me down very prettily, said she wasn't ready to remarry, and yet—" He tilted his head toward the chestnut tree, where the young man had now taken Madame Voss's hand in both of his own, with an earnestness that made Poirot wince slightly on his behalf. "Young Gerald Thorne seems to be making rather more progress than I did. He is in love with her. He is 26 and she is, by her own admission, 41, and yes, Monsieur Poirot, he is wildly, embarrassingly in love with her. His mother is not best pleased." Hartley nodded toward a stout, handsome woman in dove grey, standing near the refreshment table, watching the bench beneath the chestnut tree, with an expression that could have curdled milk. Mrs. Thorne had rather hoped Gerald would marry Miss Whitfield instead. More suitable, more English, less. He waved a hand vaguely toward Madame Voss. Complicated. Poirot followed his gesture to a fair young woman standing alone near the row of beds, very correctly dressed, very correctly miserable, watching the same scene with the particular stillness of someone trying very hard not to watch it at all. "Miss Whitfield does not look happy," Poirot observed. "Miss Whitfield," said Hartley, "has been in love with Gerald Thorne since they were children, and has watched him fall at Irina Voss's feet for the better part of a year. I shouldn't think she's been happy in some time." It was, Poirot reflected, already a garden party, with a great deal more beneath its surface than its lavender silk hostess perhaps realized. He excused himself from Captain Hartley and made his way, with the unhurried air of a man simply strolling, toward the rosebeds, where he might observe Miss Whitfield and the chestnut tree, and indeed the whole curious arrangement of the party, a little more closely. He had gone, perhaps, 10 steps, when a fourth figure entered his notice, a tall, elegant woman in pearl grey, fanning herself slowly and watching Madame Voss with an expression of such perfect, polished blankness that Poirot understood at once it concealed something rather less perfect underneath. "Lady Ashworth's sister, Mrs. Aldous Pemberton," murmured Captain Hartley, who had fallen into step beside him, apparently delighted to have found an audience. "Margaret Pemberton. She and Madame Voss were the very best of friends, once, until about 6 months ago when they were not." "What happened 6 months ago?" "No one knows," said Hartley, with evident relish. "That's rather the point, isn't it? Everyone in this garden has a piece of the story, Monsieur Poirot, and not one of them has the whole of it. Madame Voss has seen to that very carefully, I should think." Poirot said nothing, but he tucked the observation away, as he tucked away all such observations, in the small, orderly room at the back of his mind, where facts were kept until they were ready to be useful. He found himself, a few minutes later, in conversation with Miss Whitfield among the roses, a conversation she did not particularly wish to have, he sensed, but was too well bred to avoid. "You are admiring Lady Ashworth's roses, mademoiselle." "They're very fine," said Miss Whitfield, in a voice that suggested roses were the last thing on her mind. "As is the fan, carried by Madame Voss," Poirot said, watching her carefully. "A most unusual object." Something flickered across the young woman's face. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but some cousin of both. "She never goes anywhere without it," she said. I sometimes think she'd sooner lose an arm. You know her well, then? I know her fan very well. Monsieur Poirot, Miss Whitfield said, with a brittle little laugh that did not reach her eyes. I've had rather a lot of opportunity to study it this past year, from a distance. And before Poirot could press her further, she excused herself and walked quickly toward the house, leaving him to wonder precisely what a young woman might mean by such a remark, and why her eyes, just before she turned away, had gone not to Gerald Thorne's face, but to the fan itself, with an intensity that seemed to Poirot very much out of proportion to a mere ornament. The afternoon wore on. Champagne was poured. A string trio, engaged at no doubt considerable expense, played something light and forgettable beneath a striped awning. Poirot ate 2 excellent cucumber sandwiches and observed, with the patient attention of a cat at a mouse-hole, the small dramas unfolding around Madame Irina Voss, Gerald Thorne's devotion, Mrs. Thorne's disapproval, Captain Hartley's wounded pride concealed beneath dry wit, Margaret Pemberton's careful, watchful blankness, and Miss Whitfield's quiet, simmering unhappiness. It was, he thought, rather like watching 5 people stand at the edge of 5 different cliffs, each for reasons of their own. He did not yet know that one of them, or perhaps someone else entirely, someone he had not yet troubled to notice, would, before the evening was through, push Madame Voss over a cliff far more final than any of these. It was nearly 7, with the light beginning to turn gold and long across the lawn, when Lady Ashworth announced that those who wished might take a turn along the rose walk before supper, as the evening scent was, she assured everyone, not to be missed. Several guests drifted that way. Poirot, lighting a cigarette, he did not much want either. It was that sort of party, full of things one did because everyone else was doing them. Noticed that Madame Voss rose from her bench beneath the chestnut tree, fan in hand, and walked alone toward the rose walk, while Gerald Thorne was detained by his mother with the particular firmness of a woman determined to have a word with her son. Poirot watched Madame Voss go. He watched, too, who else watched her go, and was mildly surprised to note that it was almost everyone. He finished his cigarette slowly, in no great hurry, for he did not yet know that hurry would shortly become very much called for indeed. The body in the rose walk. It was Gerald Thorne who found her, and the sound he made upon finding her was one Poirot would remember for some time afterward. Not quite a scream, not quite a sob, but something raw and wordless that carried clearly across the lawn and brought the supper party to a sudden, terrible halt. Poirot reached the rose walk perhaps 30 seconds after the others, moving with the brisk, economical haste of a man who had seen such things before, and knew that haste, while necessary, must not be confused with panic. He found a small cluster of guests already gathered at the far end of the walk, where the roses gave way to a little stone bench beneath an archway of climbing white blooms, and where Madame Irina Voss lay very still upon the gravel path, her dark green gown spread about her, her eyes open to the darkening sky. She had not, Poirot saw at once, simply fainted. There was a wound at her temple, not large, but sufficient, and a smear of blood upon the stone bench that suggested she had struck her head there, or been struck against it, before falling to the path below. And in her right hand, clutched so tightly that even in death the fingers had not loosened, was the emerald fan. "Don't touch her," Poirot said, sharply enough that Mrs. Thorne, who had been reaching toward the body with the instinctive gesture of a woman wanting to help, drew back her hand at once. "No one is to touch anything, Captain Hartley." He turned to find the captain standing white-faced near the archway. "You will telephone for the police, if you please, and for a doctor, though I think the doctor will arrive too late to be of much use." Hartley went, glad, it seemed, of something to do with his hands. Gerald Thorne had sunk to his knees beside the body, and was saying her name over and over in a voice that had lost all its earlier confidence, until Lady Ashworth, with surprising gentleness for a woman who had spent the afternoon complaining about her guest, took him by the shoulders and drew him away. Was she? Lady Ashworth began, and could not finish the question, though everyone present understood it well enough. That, madame, we will determine, Poirot said. But I think we may say with some confidence that Madame Voss did not arrange to strike her own head against a stone bench for the pleasure of it. It was not, perhaps, the most tactful way to say it, but Poirot had found, over a long career, that shock loosened tongues far more effectively than gentleness, and he wished, very much, to know who said what in the first raw minutes after a death, before careful explanations could be constructed. "Who found her first?" he asked. "To no one in particular." "I did." Gerald's voice was muffled, his face buried in his hands. "I came looking for her. Mother kept me talking for ages. And when I finally got away, I came down the walk to find her, and she was just lying there. I thought she'd fainted. I thought—" He stopped, his shoulders shaking. "And you others, how did you come to be here so quickly?" It was Margaret Pemberton who answered, her pearl-grey composure entirely gone now, replaced by something hollowed out and grey beneath the surface. "We heard Gerald cry out. We were none of us far. Edmund and I were by the sundial, talking. Mrs. Thorne and Miss Whitfield were on the terrace. All of you within, what, a minute's walk of this spot?" A general, uneasy murmur of assent, and Madame Voss left the chestnut tree alone, some 20 minutes before this, to walk in this direction. "Did any of you follow her?" The silence that met this question was, to Poirot's experienced ear, considerably more interesting than any answer could have been. He looked from face to face, Gerald's wrecked with grief, his mother's carefully composed, but for a small tremor at the corner of her mouth. Captain Hartley's gone now to fetch help. Margaret Pemberton's hollow and pale, and Miss Whitfield, who stood a little apart from the others, her arms wrapped tightly about herself, staring not at the body but, Poirot noted once again, at the fan still clutched in the dead woman's hand. "I did not follow her," said Mrs. Thorne, rather too quickly. "I was speaking with my son the entire time." "I did not either," said Margaret Pemberton. "As I said, I was with Edmund." Miss Whitfield said nothing at all until Poirot turned his attention directly upon her, at which point she said, in a small voice, "I walked this way for a little while. I wanted some air. I didn't—" She swallowed. "I didn't see her. I turned back before I reached the bench." It was, Poirot thought, the sort of statement that might be perfectly true, or might be a lie constructed with just enough humility to sound true. And there was, as yet, no way to know which. The local police, when they arrived some 20 minutes later, in the person of Inspector Robert Marsh, a solid, sensible-looking man of middle years, who regarded the famous Belgian detective with the particular caution of a provincial officer, uncertain whether he was about to be helped or overshadowed, found the scene much as Poirot had left it, the body undisturbed. The guests gathered at a respectful distance, under Lady Ashworth's anxious supervision. "Monsieur Poirot," Inspector Marsh said, shaking his hand with a firm, brief grip. "I'd heard you were in the district. Didn't expect to find you standing over a body within the week. Nor did I expect it, Inspector, I assure you. I came for the lemonade." Poirot's small joke fell rather flat in the circumstances, and he did not attempt another. "The lady is Madame Arena Voss, a widow residing at the old rectory these past 2 years. She was found by Mr. Gerald Thorne some 40 minutes ago, already deceased. The wound at her temple suggests a blow, or a fall against the stone bench there, though I would not commit myself to which without the doctor's opinion." Marsh crouched beside the body, examining the wound with a practiced eye, and then his attention moved, as Poirot's had, to the fan still gripped in the dead woman's hand. "Curious thing to be holding on to so tightly," Marsh said. "Curious indeed, Inspector. I had noticed earlier in the afternoon that Madame Voss seemed never to be without it. It is, I think, rather more than an ornament to her. Or it was." Marsh glanced up at him sharply. "You think the fan matters?" "I think, Inspector, that when a woman clutches an object so tightly in death, that her fingers will not release it even now. It is generally because that object mattered to her very much in life. Whether it matters to her murderer is a question I cannot yet answer, but I should like very much to examine it properly once the doctor has finished his work. The doctor, a brisk young man named Fenwick, summoned from the village, arrived shortly after, confirmed what both Poirot and the inspector had already privately concluded, namely that Madame Voss had died from a blow to the head, very possibly delivered with considerable force against the edge of the stone bench, and that death had occurred, in his estimation, no more than half an hour before the body was discovered, which placed the time of the murder squarely within the window during which Madame Voss had walked alone toward the Rose Walk, and Gerald Thorne had been delayed by his mother. Could she have fallen and struck her head by accident? Inspector Marsh asked, though his tone suggested he did not much believe it himself. It is possible, Dr. Fenwick said, with the careful hedging of a man who did not like to commit himself prematurely. But I should want to examine her more closely before I'd say so with any confidence. The angle of the wound is a little awkward for a simple fall. I'll know more once I've had her properly on the table. It was, Poirot reflected, the sort of answer that satisfied no one and ruled out nothing, which was, in his experience, precisely the sort of answer one generally received from doctors at the scene of a death that was very probably murder. While Dr. Fenwick and his assistants attended to the removal of the body, Poirot turned his full attention to the fan, which Inspector Marsh had, with some reluctance, allowed him to examine, provided he touched nothing he should not, and reported anything of interest. It was, close up, an even more remarkable object than it had appeared from a distance. The frame was old ivory, carved with a pattern of vines that Poirot did not immediately recognize as belonging to any particular school of craftsmanship he knew. Continental, certainly, and old, perhaps 100 years or more. The leaf of dark green silk was hand-painted with extraordinary delicacy, and the emeralds set along its edge, 11 of them by Poirot's count, were of a size and quality that would have made any London jeweller's eyes widen considerably. He turned it over carefully in the handkerchief Inspector Marsh had provided, examining the reverse, the hinge mechanism, the small decorative cap at the base of the ivory handle where the blades converged, and paused. "Inspector," he said quietly, "come and look at this." "If you please." Marsh crouched beside him. "What is it?" "This cap, at the base of the handle. It does not sit quite flush with the rest of the frame. See here. There is the smallest of gaps, where the ivory does not meet the ivory beneath it, quite as it ought." Poirot's voice had taken on the particular careful stillness it acquired when his little grey cells had found something worth their attention. "I think, Inspector, that this fan was not made only to be beautiful. I think it was made also to keep a secret." Inspector Marsh looked at him, then at the fan, then back at him. "You think there's something hidden inside it. I think, mon ami, that we will not know until we look, but I should be very surprised indeed, if a woman clutched so very tightly, in the last moments of her life, an object that was nothing more than decoration." The light had gone now almost entirely from the garden, and the lanterns Lady Ashworth had lit so cheerfully some hours before threw long, uncertain shadows across the lawn, where, not so very long ago, 5 people had stood at the edges of 5 different cliffs. One of those cliffs, Poirot thought, had proved very final indeed, though for which of the 5 it had been final in a manner of cause, rather than simple proximity, remained, as yet, entirely unclear. "Tomorrow," he said to Inspector Marsh, as the last of the guests were finally permitted to disperse to their homes under careful instruction not to leave the district, "we will open this fan properly, with the right tools and the right care. Tonight, I think, we have all had quite enough." But as he walked back across the darkened lawn toward his motor car, Poirot found himself turning over, again and again, the small, strange detail that nagged at him more than any other from that long and terrible evening. Not the wound, not the silence of the suspects, not even the secret the fan very probably held. It was the look on Miss Whitfield's face, when she had stared not at the dead woman, but at the fan in her dead hand, with an expression that had seemed to him, in that confused and terrible moment, very much more like recognition than grief. Secrets behind the smiles. Inspector Marsh had set up a temporary headquarters in Lady Ashworth's morning room, a bright, chintz-covered space that struck Poirot as a faintly absurd setting in which to discuss murder, surrounded as they were by watercolors of spaniels and a great many china shepherdesses. But the room had a good table, 2 comfortable chairs, and a door that closed properly, which was, Marsh observed dryly, rather more than could be said for most rooms in most English country houses. "We'll want to speak to all 5 of them again, properly this time," Marsh said, settling himself behind the table with a notebook and the air of a man who had done this many times before and did not relish doing it again. Thorne, his mother, Hartley, Mrs. Pemberton, and the Whitfield girl. "You'll sit in, Monsieur Poirot. Lady Ashworth seems to think you're rather essential to the proceedings. I would not dream of depriving you of my company, Inspector," Poirot said, settling himself into the second chair with the particular satisfaction of a small, neat man arranging himself in a manner that pleased him. "Though I think you flatter me. It is your investigation. I am merely a guest who happened to be present at an inconvenient moment. A guest who spotted a secret compartment in the murder weapon within an hour of finding the body," Marsh said. "I'll take all the inconvenient guests of that sort I can get." They began with Gerald Thorne, who arrived looking as though he had not slept, which was, Poirot reflected, very probably true, since it could not yet have been more than 14 hours since the discovery in the Rose Walk. The young man sat heavily in the chair offered to him, his hands twisting together in his lap, and answered Marsh's questions about his movements that evening in a flat, exhausted voice that suggested grief had not yet given way to anything so useful as suspicion. "I loved her," he said, when Marsh asked, not unkindly, what his intentions toward Madame Voss had been. "I know what everyone thought, that she was too old for me, too foreign, too mysterious. I didn't care. I asked her to marry me 3 weeks ago. And her answer? She said she needed time." Gerald's jaw tightened. "She said there were things about her past she hadn't told me, and that I deserved to know them before I made up my mind. I told her it didn't matter. I told her I'd marry her if she'd robbed a bank, for all I cared." A ghost of a smile, immediately extinguished. She laughed at that. She had a lovely laugh. "Did she ever tell you what those things were? The things from her past?" "No. She kept saying she would, when the time was right. I think—" He hesitated, and Poirot, watching closely, saw something shift behind the young man's grief. Something that looked very much like a fresh and unwelcome thought arriving. "I think she was afraid of something, or someone. She'd go quiet sometimes, looking at nothing, and when I asked what was wrong, she'd just say it was nothing, the past catching up with her, and laugh it off." "Did she ever mention the fan to you? Its history?" For the first time, something like genuine animation entered Gerald's face. "She said it had belonged to her mother. She said it was the only thing she'd managed to bring out of Europe when she fled, that everything else had been lost or sold or stolen. But she'd kept the fan, sewn into the lining of her coat, the whole way across the continent. She said," his voice caught, "she said it was the only proof she had left that she'd ever had a life before the war at all." It was, Poirot thought, a touching story, and possibly even a true one. But he had heard a great many touching stories in his career, and had learned that the most touching ones were not always the most reliable. Mrs. Thorne, when her turn came, presented an altogether different picture. A woman of considerable self-possession, dressed now in unrelieved black, who answered every question with the careful precision of someone who had spent the previous evening and very probably half the night, deciding exactly what she would and would not say. I will be frank with you, Inspector, since I imagine half the village will tell you the same within the day. I did not like Madame Voss, and I did not want my son to marry her. She was twice widowed, by her own account, foreign, with no family anyone could vouch for, and considerably older than Gerald. I thought it an unsuitable match, and I told my son so, repeatedly. And did Madame Voss know of your objections? I am not in the habit of disguising my opinions, Inspector. Yes, she knew. Where were you between 6:30 and 7 o'clock yesterday evening? With my son, on the terrace, attempting, without success, as it turned out, to persuade him to think again before proposing to the woman a second time. A flicker of something crossed her composed face. I did not leave his side. You may ask him yourself, though I understand you already have. It was, Poirot noted, an alibi that depended entirely upon the word of a grieving young man who had every reason to wish his mother innocent, and who might, in his current state, agree to almost anything put to him gently enough. He made a small note of this in the orderly room at the back of his mind, and said nothing. Captain Hartley, when interviewed, was rather more forthcoming than Poirot had expected, given his dry reticence of the previous afternoon. "You'll have heard I proposed to her last spring," he said, before Marsh had even finished his first question. "No sense pretending otherwise. Half the district knows it. She turned me down. Said much the same thing she apparently told young Thorne, that she wasn't ready, that there were things in her past she hadn't settled." "Were you angry?" "Disappointed. Not angry. Or not angry enough to bash her head against a garden bench, if that's what you're asking, Inspector." Hartley's smile was thin. "I'm a farmer, with a mortgage I can't quite pay, and a roof that leaks in 4 places. I won't pretend I didn't think, once or twice, what her money might have done for me. But wanting to marry a woman for her money and wanting to kill her for refusing you are rather different things. Did you know anything of her past? Where her money came from? Jewelry, mostly, I always assumed. She'd sell the occasional piece in London, very discreetly. A friend of mine in the trade mentioned it once. Rather impressed by the quality of what she brought in. I always wondered if there mightn't be rather a lot more of it tucked away somewhere, given how carefully she doled it out. This was, Poirot thought, the first genuinely useful piece of information the morning had produced, and he made a note to ask Inspector Marsh to make inquiries with London jewellers regarding any pieces sold by a woman answering to Madame Voss's bead description. Margaret Pemberton's interview proved the most difficult of the morning, not because she was uncooperative, but because she answered every question in a voice so carefully controlled that Poirot found himself wondering what enormous effort lay beneath such perfect calm. "We were friends," she said, when asked about her relationship with the dead woman. "Close friends, for the better part of 1.5 years. And then we were not." "What happened, madame, to end the friendship?" "That is a private matter, Inspector, and I do not see that it bears on her death." "I think, madame," Poirot said gently, speaking for the first time in some while, "that you must allow us to be the judge of that. A woman is dead. Whatever passed between you, however painful, however private, it may yet hold the key to understanding why." Margaret Pemberton looked at him for a long moment, her composure cracking very slightly at the edges, like ice beginning, almost imperceptibly, to thaw. "She told me something," she said finally, in confidence, about her past, something I had promised never to repeat to another living soul. When I discovered, some months later, that she had told the same secret, with variations, to at least one other person in this village, in a manner clearly intended to win sympathy rather than to confide truthfully, I felt used, foolish. I ended the friendship. That is all I am prepared to say. The secret concerned her life before she came to England. I have told you what I am prepared to tell you, Monsieur Poirot. And though Poirot pressed gently, twice more, from slightly different angles, Margaret Pemberton would say no more on the subject, and eventually Marsh, with a small shake of his head, allowed her to go. It was Miss Whitfield's interview, last of the morning, that Poirot had been waiting for with the most interest, recalling as he did her strange, intent stare at the fan in the dead woman's hand. She came in pale and composed, sat very straight in the offered chair, and answered the preliminary questions about her movements the previous evening on the terrace with Mrs. Thorne, until she had walked alone toward the rose walk for air, then turned back before reaching the bench, in a voice that had recovered, since the previous evening, a good deal of its steadiness. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said, when Marsh had finished his questions and sat back, "I noticed something yesterday evening that I confess has troubled me rather since. When you looked upon poor Madame Voss, you did not look long at her face. You looked very intently at the fan in her hand. Can you tell me why?" Miss Whitfield's composure wavered, just slightly, like a candle flame in a draught. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do, mademoiselle. I think the fan means something to you, something beyond its considerable beauty. Will you not tell us what it is?" There was a long silence, during which Miss Whitfield's hands, folded in her lap, tightened together until the knuckles whitened. "I'd seen it before," she said finally, very quietly, "before Madame Voss ever came to this village." Inspector Marsh leaned forward sharply. "Where?" "In a photograph," Miss Whitfield said. "An old photograph that belonged to my grandmother. I found it after she died, 3 years ago, going through her things. A woman holding a fan, exactly like that one. The same ivory frame, the same green silk, the same emeralds. I'd never seen another fan like it in my life. And then Madame Voss arrived in the village 2 years ago carrying what looked, as near as I could tell, like the very same object." Poirot felt, with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has been waiting patiently for a door to open, that something of real significance had just been said. "Mademoiselle," he said carefully, "who was the woman in your grandmother's photograph?" Miss Whitfield looked up at him, and there was something in her pale, frightened face that told Poirot, before she had even spoken the words, that the answer would change the shape of the case considerably. "I don't know," she said. "There was no name written on it. Only a date, in my grandmother's hand, on the back, 1921, and a single word beneath it, in a language I couldn't read." She swallowed. "I brought the photograph with me yesterday, Monsieur Poirot, meaning to show it to Madame Voss and ask her about it before all of this happened. I have it still, in my room. I'll fetch it for you, if you wish." "I wish it very much, mademoiselle," Poirot said. "I wish it very much indeed." The fan's secret. Miss Whitfield returned within a quarter of an hour, somewhat out of breath, and laid upon the table a small, faded photograph, its edges soft with age and handling. Poirot bent over it with the particular care he reserved for objects that might prove important, and found himself looking at a young woman, dark-haired, perhaps 20 years of age, dressed in the fashion of the early 20s, holding in one gloved hand a fan that was, beyond any reasonable doubt, the very fan now resting in Inspector Marsh's evidence box. "You are certain," Poirot said slowly, "that this is the same fan?" "As certain as I can be, without holding the two side by side," Miss Whitfield said. "But, Monsieur Poirot, I have looked at this photograph, perhaps 100 times since my grandmother died. I should know that fan if I saw it in a crowd of 1,000 others." Poirot turned the photograph over, as Miss Whitfield had described, and found the date, 1921, written in a careful, old-fashioned hand, and beneath it a single word in unfamiliar characters that he did not immediately recognize, though something about their shape tugged faintly at a memory he could not yet place. "Inspector," he said, "I think we must send this to someone who can read it, and I think, also, that the time has come to open the fan itself and discover what secret it has been keeping so very carefully all this while." It was done that same afternoon, in the presence of Inspector Marsh, a locksmith, summoned discreetly from the nearby town, and Poirot himself, in the privacy of the morning room with the curtains drawn, as though the fan's secret, once released, might otherwise escape into the wrong hands before they had even seen it. The locksmith, a patient, elderly man named Brigg, who handled the fan with the reverent care of someone accustomed to delicate old mechanisms, worked at the small ivory cap at the base of the handle for nearly 20 minutes before it gave, with a small click that seemed, in the hushed room, almost shockingly loud. Inside the hollow handle, rolled tightly enough to fit within a space no larger than a man's little finger, was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle with age, and a small, oval-framed photograph no bigger than a thumbnail, of a child, a girl, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, solemn-faced, dressed in clothes that spoke unmistakably of money and of a world that no longer existed. Poirot unrolled the paper with infinite care, watched by Marsh and Brigg in a silence that had taken on, somehow, the quality of held breath. It was a letter, written in a language Poirot did not read fluently, though he recognized enough of its Slavic shape to guess at Polish or perhaps Hungarian. But it was not the letter's content that struck him first. It was the signature at its foot, and beside it, embossed faintly into the paper itself, a small crest, 2 crossed swords beneath a crown, surrounded by lettering too fine to read without a glass. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "I believe we are going to need a translator, and rather urgently. But I think, even without one, that we have found the heart of Madame Voss's secret. This is no mere keepsake. This is a document of some importance, and that crest is not the crest of an ordinary family." Marsh peered at the crest, frowning. "Could be anything. Could be decorative. It could," Poirot agreed. "But I have seen, in my career, a certain number of crests belonging to families of consequence on the continent, and this one has the look of authenticity rather than ornament. I should like Lady Ashworth's library searched for any reference book on continental heraldry she might possess, and I should like, very much, to know whether anyone in this village reads Polish or Hungarian with any fluency." It was, in the event, Margaret Pemberton, summoned back rather reluctantly to the morning room, who proved unexpectedly useful in this regard, for upon being shown the crest, though not the letter's contents, her careful composure slipped entirely for the first time since the murder. "That is the Voss family crest," she said, her voice gone suddenly unsteady. "Or, no, that isn't right. That isn't her name at all." "Madame," Poirot said gently, "I think the time has come for you to tell us the secret Irina Voss confided in you, the one you have so carefully protected until now. I think it concerns this crest, does it not?" Margaret Pemberton was silent for a long moment, twisting her hands together, and when she finally spoke, it was in a low, rushed voice, as though she had been holding the words back so long that they came now all in a rush, eager to be free. "Her name was not Voss," she said. "Not originally. She told me, 18 months ago, in the strictest confidence, that she had been born into a noble family in Poland, a family of some standing, though she would never tell me precisely how great. She said that during the war, her family had been all but destroyed, her parents killed, her elder sister taken by the Germans and never seen again, her family's estate seized, and its contents scattered or stolen. She said she had escaped as a young woman with almost nothing, that she had changed her name to protect herself in the chaos of those years, and that she had spent much of the time since trying, quietly, to recover what fragments of her family's fortune she could trace, jewelry, mostly, that had been sold or looted and had found its way, piece by piece, into the hands of dealers and collectors across Europe. "And the fan?" Poirot asked. "She said it was the last thing she had that connected her to her mother. She said it had been in her family for 3 generations, and that her mother had sewn it into the lining of a coat with her own hands the night before Irina fled, telling her that whatever else was lost, she must keep this, because it was proof of who she truly was, should she ever need to claim her name again. Claim her name how, madame? What did she mean by this? Margaret Pemberton hesitated, and Poirot saw, with the particular clarity that came to him at such moments, that they were approaching the very center of the matter. She told me, Margaret said slowly, that her sister, the one taken during the war, might not be dead after all. That she had received word, not long before she came to this village, that a woman answering her sister's description had survived and was living under another name somewhere in England. She said that if this were true, the two of them between them might have a claim, a legal claim, through certain family holdings that had been frozen rather than destroyed during the war, to a fortune considerably greater than anything she had managed to recover so far through the sale of individual pieces. The room had gone very quiet. "And this," Poirot said softly, "is the secret you say she told to someone else also, in a manner that made you feel, how did you put it, used?" Margaret flushed, the first real color Poirot had seen in her face since the investigation began. "Yes, I discovered, by accident, that she had told a similar story, with details altered, exaggerated in places, I thought, designed to win greater sympathy, to at least one other person in this village. It made me wonder whether any of what she'd told me was entirely true, or whether I'd simply been the recipient of a story she told different people in different ways, to different ends. To whom did she tell this altered version?" Margaret Pemberton's eyes flicked, almost involuntarily, toward the door through which Miss Whitfield had departed some 20 minutes before. "I believe," she said quietly, "that you ought to ask Miss Whitfield that question yourself, Monsieur Poirot. I think you will find the answer rather more illuminating than anything further I can tell you." It was Inspector Marsh who voiced the thought that had, by this point, begun to take firm shape in Poirot's own mind. "You're suggesting," he said slowly, "that the Whitfield girl's grandmother might be connected to all this. The photograph, the fan in it. Could the grandmother have been the sister?" Poirot finished quietly. "It is, I think, a possibility we cannot now avoid considering, Inspector. A woman who survived the war under another name, who settled eventually in rural England, who had a granddaughter who grew up not knowing the full truth of her own family's history, and who has now, by the strangest and most painful of coincidences, found herself standing rather close to the center of a murder investigation involving the very fan that proves the connection. If Miss Whitfield's grandmother truly was Madame Voss's sister," Marsh said, working it through aloud, "what? And if there's a fortune at stake, frozen assets, family holdings, then Miss Whitfield herself stands to inherit a very great deal, doesn't she? If her grandmother's claim could be established." "She does," Poirot agreed, "which gives her, I am sorry to say, mon ami, a motive of very considerable size indeed. Rather larger, I think, than wounded pride over a lost suitor." It was not a comfortable thought, and Poirot did not enjoy entertaining it, for he had found something genuinely sympathetic in Miss Whitfield's pale, unhappy face. But he had learned, across a very long career, that sympathy and innocence were not the same thing, and that the most painful conclusions were very often also the correct ones. "We will need that letter translated without delay," he said, "and we will need to speak to Miss Whitfield again, this time, I think rather more searchingly than before. And we will need," he added, almost to himself, "to discover precisely what Madame Voss told her, and when, and whether the promise of a fortune might have proved, in the end, rather too tempting a thing to wait patiently for." Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade once more across Lady Ashworth's gardens, gold turning gradually to grey, and Poirot, gathering the photograph and the unread letter carefully into a leather case for safekeeping, felt the particular weight that came, in every case, at the moment when a comfortable theory began to feel rather less comfortable than it had before. A web of lies. Miss Whitfield was sent for again, and this time she came looking less like a frightened young woman and more like one who had spent the intervening hour bracing herself for precisely the conversation that was about to take place. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began, with rather less gentleness than he had employed earlier that day, "we have learned something of Madame Voss's history that I think concerns you directly. We have reason to believe that her sister, taken from her family during the war and long thought dead, may in fact have survived, settled in England under another name, and lived out her life here, never knowing the truth of what became of the family she lost. We have reason to believe, mademoiselle, that this sister may have been your grandmother." Miss Whitfield went very white, and for a moment Poirot thought she might faint, but she gripped the arms of her chair and held herself upright with visible effort. "She told me," she said, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, "Madame Voss, 3 weeks ago, she came to call on me, alone, while Gerald was away in London on business, and she told me she believed my grandmother might have been her sister, that she'd been making inquiries since she arrived in the district, that something about my grandmother's old photographs, which I'd once shown Gerald, and which he must have mentioned to her, had caught her attention." "And what did she propose, mademoiselle?" "When she told you this, she said that if it could be proven, through documents, through the fan, through whatever evidence remained, there might be a fortune to be claimed, family holdings frozen during the war, she said, that neither of us knew anything about until now. She said we ought to pursue it together as the only 2 surviving members of the family." Miss Whitfield's hands trembled in her lap. "She said it would change everything for me, that I needn't worry any longer about whether Gerald's mother thought me a suitable match, because I would have money of my own, more money, she said, than the Thorns had ever had." "This must have seemed," Poirot said carefully, "a very great deal to absorb all at once." "It seemed like a fairy story, Monsieur Poirot. I didn't believe a word of it. Not really. Not until I saw the fan again, properly, at the garden party, and recognized it beyond all doubt from my grandmother's photograph. Then I began to wonder whether it might, after all, be true." "And this is why you stared at the fan so intently. When you found her body, you were thinking, even then, of the fortune it represented." "It was," Poirot realized the instant the words left his mouth, both an unkind question and a leading one, and he saw Miss Whitfield flinch as though he had struck her. "I was thinking," she said, with sudden sharp dignity, "that the only person who could have told me the truth about my own grandmother was lying dead on a gravel path, and that whatever she knew had very probably died with her. I was not thinking about money, Monsieur Poirot. I had not even decided, until this very conversation, whether I believed her story at all." It was a fair rebuke, and Poirot, to his credit, acknowledged it with a small, apologetic inclination of his head. "You will forgive me, mademoiselle. It was a poor question, asked carelessly. Tell me instead, did anyone else know of this conversation between you and Madame Voss?" "I told no one. I didn't know what to make of it myself, let alone how to explain it to others." She hesitated, though I wonder now whether she might have told someone else. She did love an audience. Monsieur Poirot, whatever else she was, I don't think keeping a secret entirely to herself came naturally to her. It was, Poirot reflected afterward, precisely the sort of detail that ought to have prompted him to look rather more carefully at who else might have known. But he was tired, and the afternoon was wearing on, and he allowed himself, in that moment, the small human failing of following the thread that seemed most promising rather than the one that was, in fact, most important. For Miss Whitfield's alibi, when examined again, proved frustratingly thin. She had been alone on the Rose Walk during precisely the window in which Madame Voss had died. By her own admission, she had a motive, now established, of very considerable size, and she had lied, by omission at least, about the nature of her last conversation with the victim. It was, Poirot thought, building into rather a compelling case, and he found himself, over the course of that long afternoon, increasingly inclined to believe that the gentle, unhappy young woman before him had, In a moment of desperation or temptation he did not yet fully understand, struck the woman who held the key to her fortune and her future, and let her fall. "I think, Inspector," he said to Marsh, once Miss Whitfield had been allowed to leave, "that we must consider Miss Whitfield our principal suspect. The motive is substantial, the opportunity is established, and her account of events has changed, by her own admission, at least once already today." Marsh frowned. "You sound less than entirely convinced yourself, Monsieur Poirot, if you don't mind my saying so." "I am not entirely convinced," Poirot admitted, "but I am perhaps persuaded more by the shape of the evidence than I ought to be at this stage. It is a fault of mine, Inspector. When I am tired, I begin to prefer the theory that explains the most facts most tidily, rather than continuing to ask whether some other theory, less tidy but more true, might yet exist." It was, in fact, rather more of an admission than Poirot generally permitted himself, and Marsh, sensing something unusual in it, said nothing further on the subject, though he made a note in his book all the same. They turned their attention, before the day was through, to the matter of the letter, which had finally been sent to a translator in London, with connections to the Polish community there, a process that would, they were told, take at least 2 more days to complete. And they turned also to Captain Hartley's suggestion regarding London jewellers, dispatching a young constable to make discreet inquiries regarding any pieces of fine continental jewellery sold in recent years by a woman answering Madame Voss's description. It was in the course of this second inquiry that something curious emerged, not from London, but from Lady Ashworth's own household, where a maid, questioned almost as an afterthought, mentioned that she had seen Captain Hartley walking in the direction of the Rose Walk shortly before the alarm was raised, though Hartley himself had stated firmly that he had been with Margaret Pemberton by the sundial the entire time. "He lied to us," Marsh said, "when this discrepancy was brought to his attention late that evening. Or the maid is mistaken, one or the other. Or," Poirot said slowly, feeling the comfortable shape of his afternoon's theory begin, very slightly, to shift beneath him, Captain Hartley walked toward the Rose Walk for some innocent reason entirely unconnected to the murder, and saw no need to mention a fact that placed him, however briefly, rather closer to the scene than he would have liked. "People lie, Inspector, for a great many reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with guilt. But I confess, this complicates, rather than simplifies, the picture I had begun to form." He sat for a long while that evening. In the small guest room Lady Ashworth had insisted he occupy rather than return to his hotel, turning the day's revelations over in his mind with the particular dissatisfaction of a man who knows he has been too quick to settle upon a comfortable answer. Miss Whitfield had motive and opportunity, yes, but so, it now appeared, might Captain Hartley, whose alibi had just developed an unexplained gap. And Margaret Pemberton's careful, painful confession had revealed a woman who had felt deceived and humiliated by Madame Voss's casual handling of a confidence, a wound that might, in the wrong circumstances, fester into something considerably darker than mere hurt feelings. Even Mrs. Thorne, whose alibi rested entirely upon the word of a son too grief-stricken to be a reliable witness, could not yet be fully set aside. "I have been careless," Poirot murmured to himself, in the quiet of the lamplit room, "allowing the most dramatic motive to eclipse my consideration of the others. A fortune is a powerful thing, mon ami, but it is not the only thing that drives a person to violence. Jealousy, humiliation, fear of exposure, these also kill, and kill quite as effectively as greed." He resolved, before sleep finally claimed him, that the following day would be given over not to confirming the theory he had already half formed, but to testing it properly against every alternative he had been too tired or too satisfied to consider with sufficient rigor that afternoon. It was, he reflected, rather a humbling resolution, for a man of his reputation to be obliged to make. But Hercule Poirot had not survived so many years and so many cases by refusing to admit, when the evidence demanded it, that even his own little grey cells were not above the occasional, very human, error of judgment. The little grey cells. The translation of the letter arrived from London on the morning of the third day, carried by the same young constable who had been dispatched to make inquiries among the city's jewellers, and who brought with him, in addition to the translator's careful work, a piece of information that struck Poirot the moment he heard it, with the particular force of a fact that rearranges everything around it. "The jewellers, sir," the constable reported to Inspector Marsh, with Poirot listening intently from his customary chair by the window. "3 of them in Hatton Garden. Remember dealing with a woman matching Madame Voss's description, selling pieces of fine continental jewellery over the past 18 months or so. But it's the 4th one that's interesting, sir. A Mr. Aldous Pemberton went in not 3 months ago, trying to sell a brooch. Emerald, old setting, very fine work. And when the jeweller asked where he'd come by it, he said it had belonged to a deceased aunt. The jeweller didn't think much of it at the time, but when I showed him the description of Madame Voss's fan, sir, he said the workmanship on that brooch was the closest thing he'd seen to it in 30 years in the trade." Poirot sat very still. "Aldous Pemberton," he said slowly. "Margaret Pemberton's husband." "That's right, sir. Inspector," Poirot said, rising from his chair with sudden energy. "I think we have been looking, these past 2 days, rather too narrowly at the people Madame Voss spoke with, directly, and not nearly carefully enough at what might have passed, quietly, between those people and others in their own households. Margaret Pemberton told us she felt deceived by Madame Voss. Used, she said, when she discovered the secret she'd been told in confidence had been shared elsewhere also. But what if it was not merely a wound to her pride? What if her husband, hearing the same story, perhaps through his wife, perhaps through Madame Voss herself, in some unguarded moment, saw in it not a betrayal of confidence, but an opportunity? Marsh frowned. An opportunity for what? For theft. "Inspector, consider, if Madame Voss possessed, as we have established, a quantity of fine jewellery connected to her family's recovered fortune, and if Aldous Pemberton knew of this, and knew also, through his wife, something of its history and value, might he not have helped himself, quietly, to a piece here and there, confident that a woman so determined to protect her secrets would never dare report the theft to the police, for fear of drawing attention to the very past she had spent 2 years concealing? It was, Poirot acknowledged even as he said it, a theory built upon a single brooch and a good deal of inference, but it had the particular quality, which he had learned over many years to trust, of explaining several previously disconnected facts at once. Margaret Pemberton's bitter sense of betrayal, which might have run deeper than mere wounded friendship if she had also discovered her own husband's dishonesty. The fortune Captain Hartley had spoken of, which might have been considerably diminished by quiet theft rather than honest sale, and the alibi gap that had troubled Poirot 2 evenings before, since Margaret Pemberton had claimed to have spent the crucial half-hour with her husband by the sundial, an alibi that protected them both equally, whether or not it was true. "We must speak with Mr. Pemberton directly," Poirot said, and rather urgently, before he has further opportunity to prepare his answers. Aldous Pemberton, when finally located and brought to the morning room, he had been, he explained with some irritation, occupied with estate business, and saw no reason why a man's morning should be disturbed for the 3rd time in as many days. Proved to be a heavy-set, florid man of perhaps 50, with the particular blustering confidence of someone accustomed to having his word taken at face value. "I don't know what you're implying, Inspector," he said, when Marsh raised the matter of the brooch, "but I'll have you know that piece belonged to my late aunt, exactly as I told the jeweller. There's nothing improper in a man selling family jewellery when circumstances require it." "Your aunt?" Poirot said mildly. Might we ask her name, monsieur, and the date of her death? We should like, naturally, to verify the provenance of so fine a piece." It was a small thing, this request for verification, but Poirot watched with the particular attention of a man who had asked a great many such small questions over a great many years, as Pemberton's bluster faltered, just slightly, before he answered, "I don't see that it's any business of the police, what my late relatives were called." "It becomes the business of the police, monsieur," Marsh said, with rather more force than he had employed thus far, when a brooch matching the description of jewelry belonging to a murder victim is sold by a man who cannot produce the name of the relative he claims to have inherited it from. The silence that followed this stretched long enough that Poirot began to wonder whether Pemberton would simply refuse to answer at all. But then, quite suddenly, the bluster collapsed entirely, like a poorly built wall given one push too many. "I didn't kill her," Pemberton said, his voice gone thin and frightened. "Whatever you think I've done, I didn't kill the woman. I took the brooch. Yes, I'll admit that much, since you've apparently traced it back to me. Margaret told me the whole ridiculous story months ago, in confidence, the way women do, not thinking I'd make anything of it. But I was in difficulty, gentlemen. Debts I haven't told even my wife about. Debts that were becoming rather pressing, and when I learned that Madame Voss kept a quantity of unset stones and old pieces in a strongbox at the old rectory, I thought." He stopped, swallowing. "I thought one piece, taken quietly, sold discreetly, would solve my difficulties and never be missed by a woman with so very much to lose by complaining of the theft." "You broke into her house?" Marsh demanded. "I didn't break in. She'd shown the strongbox to Margaret once, carelessly, and Margaret had mentioned, again without thinking, where the spare key was kept, beneath a particular flower pot by the kitchen door, in case of fire, she'd said, so the servants might retrieve valuables quickly. I let myself in one afternoon, when I knew she was out, took a single piece, and left everything else exactly as it was. I never went near her again. I never even spoke to the woman directly, in all the time she lived at the rectory, beyond the merest courtesies at gatherings such as this one." "And on the evening of the murder?" Poirot asked. "Where were you, monsieur, in truth, since your wife's account of your whereabouts has proved, shall we say, somewhat less than entirely satisfactory upon examination?" Pemberton's face, already pale, went paler still. "I was with Margaret by the sundial, exactly as she said. I swear it before God, Inspector. I have done a dishonest thing, and I am ashamed of it. But I have done no murder, and Margaret can confirm every minute of where I stood that evening, because she stood there with me the entire time, neither of us straying so much as 10 yards from that spot." It was, Poirot thought, watching the man's evident terror, very probably the truth. A guilty man confessing freely to a lesser crime in order to clear himself of a far graver one, which was a pattern he had observed often enough to recognize with some confidence. And, if Pemberton and his wife had indeed remained together by the sundial throughout the crucial half-hour, as both now insisted with rather more conviction than either had managed 2 days before, then neither of them, whatever their other sins, could have been the hand that struck Irina Voss. "This account will need to be verified most thoroughly," Marsh said, "and you will answer, in due course, for the theft, monsieur, whatever else comes of this. But I confess, Monsieur Poirot, if this man and his wife were together throughout, we are left rather where we started, with Miss Whitfield's motive, Captain Hartley's unexplained movements, and Mrs. Thorne's uncorroborated alibi, and no clearer notion than before of which among them struck the fatal blow." Poirot, however, had gone very quiet, his attention drawn not to Pemberton's confession itself, but to a small detail within it, that seemed, the longer he turned it over, to glow with an unexpected significance. "Monsieur Pemberton," he said slowly, "you said that Madame Voss kept a quantity of unset stones and old pieces in a strongbox, jewelry beyond what she wore or carried with her. You said also that your wife knew of this strongbox because Madame Voss had shown it to her, carelessly, on some occasion in the past. That's right. Did your wife ever mention to you, in any of these unguarded conversations, precisely how Madame Voss came to recover this jewelry? Whether it arrived all at once, or piece by piece, over time, and from whom, if she ever named a source? Pemberton frowned, clearly searching his memory. Margaret did say, once, that Madame Voss received certain pieces by post from the continent through some arrangement she'd made with a dealer there who was helping her trace items that had once belonged to her family. She said Madame Voss had grown quite anxious recently, agitated, even, about one particular piece she was expecting, something she said would, in her own words, prove everything beyond doubt. I remember Margaret repeating the phrase because it struck her as rather theatrical. Something cold and clear settled into place in Poirot's mind. The particular sensation, both unwelcome and deeply familiar, of a case beginning at last to assume its true shape. A shape rather different from the one he had so carelessly accepted 2 evenings before. "Inspector," he said, "I think we must ask ourselves a question we have not yet properly asked. Madame Voss believed she was on the verge of proving, beyond doubt, both her own identity and her claim to a considerable fortune. She had told this story, in varying forms, to at least 3 people in this village: Margaret Pemberton, Miss Whitfield, and, I now suspect, perhaps one other besides. Each of these people stood to be affected, in some way, by what she might prove. But I have been asking myself only who stood to gain from her death. I think now I must ask, with rather more urgency, who stood to lose the most from what she was about to prove in life, and whether that loss might have felt to the person concerned very much more pressing and immediate than any of the fortune everyone else has been so busy imagining. It was a subtle distinction, but Poirot felt, as he said it, the particular quiet certainty that told him he had finally asked the right question. 3 days, and one significant misstep, later than he would have liked, but asked, at last, all the same. The truth in the garden. Poirot asked that all the suspects be gathered once more in Lady Ashworth's drawing-room that same evening. Gerald Thorne, his mother, Margaret, and Aldous Pemberton, Miss Whitfield, and Captain Hartley, along with Lady Ashworth herself and Inspector Marsh, and though the request caused a good deal of uneasy murmuring among those assembled, none of them refused to come. The drawing-room, unlike the chintz-covered morning-room, had a certain formal grandeur to it. Tall windows looking out over the now darkened lawn, a fire lit against the evening chill despite the season, and a great many family portraits regarding the proceedings with the painted indifference of generations past. Poirot stood before the fire, small and neat and entirely composed, and waited until the last of the guests had taken their seats before he began. "I must thank you all," he said, "for your patience these past 3 days, which I know cannot have been easy, and for your continued cooperation, which has been, on the whole, considerably more candid than I am accustomed to receiving in cases of this nature. We have learned, in the course of this investigation, a great deal about Madame Irina Voss, rather more, I think, than any of you suspected when she first came among you 2 years ago," he explained, patiently, the substance of what they had learned, her true noble birth, her family's destruction during the war, her long search for a sister thought dead, and the fan's hidden letter that had finally confirmed Miss Whitfield's grandmother as that very sister. "This is all very well, Monsieur Poirot," Mrs. Thorne said, with some asperity, "but I confess, I do not see how any of it tells us who killed the wretched woman." "I am coming to that, madame, though I confess it has taken me rather longer to arrive there than it ought to have done. I made, 2 days ago, an error of judgment that I am not proud of. I allowed the size of one motive to eclipse my proper consideration of the others, and I came perilously close to building a case against a young woman whose only true crime was inheriting a grandmother's secret she did not fully understand herself. I owe you an apology, mademoiselle, for the harshness of some of my questions 2 days ago.
You were only doing your duty.
Monsieur Poirot, Miss Whitfield said quietly, though there was real relief in her face. That is generous of you, but it does not excuse carelessness, even in service of duty. The error, once recognized, proved instructive. It forced me to ask a different question entirely. Not who stood to gain from Madame Voss's death, but who stood to lose, urgently and irrevocably, from what she was on the verge of proving while she yet lived. He turned now, and his gaze settled, with quiet but unmistakable purpose, upon Captain Hartley, who had gone very still in his chair. Captain Hartley, you told us, when we first spoke, that you had once proposed marriage to Madame Voss and been refused. You suggested this gave you cause for disappointment, but not for violence. I believed you, largely because the motive seemed modest. But you mentioned something else also, that a friend of yours in the jewelry trade had spoken admiringly of pieces Madame Voss had been selling discreetly in London. I don't see what's remarkable in that, Hartley said, his voice tight. I told you as much, freely enough. You did, Captain, and I have wondered since why a man would volunteer such a detail so readily. Unless he felt it safer to offer a small, true thing than to risk a larger lie being discovered later. When our constable made inquiries among the jewelers of Hatton Garden, he found a fourth man, yourself, who had sold no fewer than 6 pieces of fine continental jewelry over the past year, pieces which matched descriptions Madame Voss gave her solicitor of her family's recovered holdings, with a precision that cannot be explained by coincidence. The room had gone very quiet. Hartley's face had drained of all colour. You did not propose to Madame Voss for love alone, though I do not doubt some genuine feeling existed. You proposed, I think, because marriage would have given you legitimate access to a fortune you had already begun, quietly, to siphon away. When she refused you, you continued more carefully, confident she would never risk exposing the theft by reporting it and drawing attention to her own hidden past. This is conjecture, Hartley said, but his voice had lost its earlier dryness entirely. It was conjecture, Captain, until 3 days ago, when Madame Voss told someone, I believe it was you, in some unguarded moment when you called to renew your suit, that she was on the verge of obtaining final, irrefutable proof of her identity, proof that would bring proper legal administration of her estate, solicitors, a careful accounting of every piece that had passed through her hands, an accounting that would have exposed your theft beyond any hope of concealment. Hartley's hands had begun to tremble where they rested on his knees. A maid saw you walking toward the Rose Walk shortly before the alarm was raised, a detail you omitted, claiming instead to have been with Mrs. Pemberton by the sundial the entire time, which she cannot, in truth, fully confirm. I believe you went to speak with Madame Voss privately, to learn how far her inquiries had progressed. I believe the conversation did not go as you hoped, and I believe that, facing not merely the loss of a woman you once wished to marry, but the certain ruin of your reputation and your liberty, you struck her, Captain Hartley, and let her fall against that stone bench, and left her there among the roses she had so admired only an hour before. For a long moment, Hartley said nothing at all. Then his shoulders sagged, all at once, like a man finally setting down a weight he had carried too long to bear. I didn't mean to kill her, he said quietly. I went to ask her, one final time, whether there mightn't be some arrangement we could reach, some way I could return what I'd taken, quietly, before anyone need know. She laughed at me, not unkindly, I think, in her own mind, but I had spent a year managing my fear of discovery, and to be laughed at, in that moment, when everything I had was about to collapse around me. He stopped, swallowing hard. I struck her, without entirely meaning to. I have asked myself 100 times since whether I might have stopped myself. I only know that by the time I understood what I had done, it was already done. Inspector Marsh rose. "Captain Edmund Hartley, I am arresting you for the murder of Madame Irina Voss. You are not obliged to say anything further, but anything you do say may be used in evidence." It was done quietly, almost gently, and within minutes, Hartley had been led away into the soft dark of the evening, leaving behind a drawing room full of people, absorbing the strange, unhappy completeness of an answer they had not expected. "I am sorry, mademoiselle," Poirot said at last to Miss Whitfield, "that the truth of your family's history came to you in so terrible a manner. But I think, when the legal matters are properly settled, you will find that your grandmother's sister left behind a fortune to which you have a legitimate claim. And I think Madame Voss, whatever her flaws, would have wished for nothing more than that the niece she never properly came to know should inherit what remained of the family she spent so much of her life trying to recover." Miss Whitfield said nothing, but the tears that finally came seemed, to Poirot's experienced eye, considerably more healing than the careful composure she had maintained for 3 long days. Later that evening, walking once more across Lady Ashworth's lawn beneath a sky now clear and full of stars, Poirot reflected, as he often did at the close of a case, upon the strange and various weights an object might come to carry over the course of a life. A fan, beautiful and old, carried across a continent in the lining of a coat by a frightened young woman fleeing everything she had known, kept for 30 years as proof of a name she dared not always claim, and clutched, in the final moments of her life, not from fear, he thought now, but from a kind of fierce, instinctive loyalty to everything it represented: her mother, her sister, her family, herself. It had been, in the end, exactly what Madame Voss had always said it was, the one thing that remained, when everything else had been lost or stolen or destroyed, to prove that she had truly been who she claimed to be. Even, Poirot thought, as he climbed at last into his waiting motor car, in death,